Hello there, this is Welsh ASMR 82. Hey, how you doing? In this ASMR video, which is the type of video to help you relax and maybe even fall asleep, which is why I'm sometimes talking like a total weirdo in whispers, and talking really slowly and calmly, I'm gonna talk to you and explain the Asian Champions League. So this has been requested quite a few times, and I'm really into the Asian Champions League because of Football Manager, blame that. And yeah, I kind of know quite a lot about it, so the fact that you guys have requested it, I wanted to do a video on it anyway, so I'm going to go ahead. We're going to do it in two parts. This part is part one, where I'm basically going to explain all about the Asian Champions League, because it has been historically quite different to the European Champions League. So that's why in this little ramble, ASMR ramble video, I'm going to explain what it's been like, what it's currently like, and what I imagine it's going to be like in the future. And then in the part two, we're going to actually look at the next and upcoming season of the Champions League and do some predictions. I'm guessing that this is going to become more and more popular in the future for two reasons. One, because their own marketing campaign is trying to target a European viewing audience, and two, because of this summer's Saudi Arabian League, how it was already one of the strongest competitions in the Asian Champions League, and how it's going to really excite to have people to watch those big players, household names playing in the continental competition. Okay, so let's talk about it from scratch, and I really hope you enjoy the video. And if you don't find it relaxing or helping you sleep, then maybe you just find it interesting, engage with a comment, press like, click subscribe, and yeah, that would be awesome. Okay, here we go. Okay, Asian Champions League. Why is it not the same as the European Champions League? Couple of reasons. Okay, I thought about this and I didn't know where to start actually. So there's a couple of things you're probably assuming about the Champions League. Number one, you gain access to it by finishing first place or top four in your domestic league. That bit is mostly correct. The weird thing about the Asian Champions League is because there's no Europa League or Conference League equivalent, everyone goes just into the Champions League in Asia. So that means if you win your domestic cup, you also qualify for the Champions League, which I think probably makes the domestic competition cups in each of the Asian leagues a little bit more desirable to win and more competitive. So if you are, for example, in a country where there are only 2 spots into the Champions League, you'll get one for finishing absolute top of the league at the end of the season, and the other one won't go to second place, it'll actually go to the winner of the domestic cup. So examples of this in the past, I think Thailand have got more spots now, but in the past, Thailand being quite a competitive league, you had to finish top to get into the Champions League. Second wasn't good enough, let alone third or fourth, or you had to win the domestic cup. And of course, in the situation, if the same team did the double, the team that came second in the league would be awarded the second qualification spot for the Champions League. So yeah, that's the way that it works a little bit differently. There is a second continental competition, but historically it's been for countries that don't make the grade. So that's the other assumption. Even Andorra, Kosovo, Luxembourg qualify for the European Champions League. They just don't make it to the group stages because they get knocked out in the initial qualifiers. That is not the case for the Asian Champions League. Historically, it is becoming a little bit more similar to Europe in this sense. So historically, only the top leagues gained access to the Champions League. So for example, if you were in North Korea or Turkmenistan, you couldn't qualify for the Champions League. Doesn't matter if you finish first or whatever. They have expanded it in the last 2 years, and they have gained access to at least one club from almost all the nations in Asia. And they have a similar process where they they have knockout stages. But to be fair to them, they have expanded the competition. We'll talk about that in a second. So that some nations just get automatic qualification into the group stages because there are more groups now. But still, there are a couple of countries that either don't want to be in the Asian Champions League, we'll talk about why in a second, or don't meet the criteria. It has been known, even in the last 2-3 years, for a team to finish first in their league, but because they didn't pay for the license for the Asian Champions League, they can't play in it the next year, and then either the second or third team qualifies. There was a weird case a couple of years ago where someone who finished 4th, was it Iraq? I can't remember which country it was, but there was a country where none of the teams wanted to pay the extra money for the Asian Champions League qualification certificate for the following year in case they did well. They won the league, and I think the 4th place team made it into the Asian Champions League. Yeah, one of the reasons for this is, I speculate, and maybe some of you might know the answer, is because money-wise it isn't anywhere near as rich as the Champions League. You know, we're talking, if you win the Champions League, I think you get something like just a single win in the group stage is worth £500,000, but in the Asian Champions League it's nowhere near that. It's something like £10,000 or something. And we'll come to the costs in a second because that really complicates things in Asia, travel costs. Okay, so yeah, the Asian Champions League doesn't have the funding and the sponsorship that the European Champions League has. So it is not quite as desirable competition for some leagues. Those leagues, for example, that know they're not going to win it, it's still incredibly popular for some of the countries that take it very seriously, such as Saudi Arabia, Japan, Korea, etc. Okay, one other assumption is you probably think there are 8 groups and the top 2 from each group go through to the knockout rounds. This changed last year. It was the case last year, however, to expand the competition and invite more Asian leagues to participate, because as I suggested earlier, what was happening was only a couple of countries were invited, and therefore it was the same sorts of teams every year. It was becoming a little bit predictable, and it was sort of flooded with teams from Japan, Korea, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE. So in order to expand the competition to try and get, a very lucrative Indian audience in, for example, another lucrative audience is Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. So in order to get more of those countries involved, the structure changed. So there are actually 10 groups now, and the way this works is you have to finish top. So yeah, okay, there are slightly weaker teams in the competition. You might have, the winner of the Tajikistan League, but you have to finish top in order to guarantee a spot. It's similar to what the Europa League have done. So then the best, I think it's the best 6 overall, so the best 6 second place teams also make it through. So there's no guarantee that you will get through if you finish just second. So that has ramped up the competitiveness of the league a little, and you can't go for a draw anymore. You have to try and go for a win, because if you don't finish top, it's not in your hands anymore. You have to wait for one of the other teams and see how they do, whether they get more points than you in second spot. And someone really big from the Qatari League, I think it was Al-Sadd, which is the team that quite a few Spaniards played for and Xavi was manager of. I think they came second, and they basically didn't qualify for the next round, and they're a team that likes to feel that they should be, competing for the title itself. So that was a bit of a shock. Okay, the other massive thing that's different between the Asian Champions League and the European Champions League is they have, very similar to the MLS in the States, they have a Western Conference and an Eastern Conference. If you can imagine, if you live in Jordan, which is, just next to Cyprus, not far from Turkey, and you pull someone in Australia in your group stage, you have to basically travel half the world in order to get there. This isn't manageable, and because of low sponsorship money, the Confederation have to pay travel costs as well, so it was costing them quite a lot of money, and they'd be tired for their domestic matches when they got back from this, mammoth journey. So to stop this happening, what they did was they have everyone to the west of China in the Western Conference, and everyone including China to the east is in the Eastern Conference, including Australia. I'll come back to Australia in a second, because you might be thinking, hang on a minute, Australia aren't in Asia. I know, we'll come to that. Okay, so there are a couple of teams that in the past have qualified for either. I remember a weird situation about 3 or 4 years ago when Uzbekistan, the winners of the Uzbekistan League, was in the West Conference, but either the second or third team to qualify went into the East Conference. So from the same nation, you had ones in both the West and the East, because it's sort of smack bang in the middle. Uzbekistan is right next to China, so they felt it didn't matter too much. They have changed that now to make it a bit more concise. So yeah, if you are, for example, Iran, you will play always in the West. And if you are Singapore or South Korea, you will always play in the East. It does mean that you don't have as many sort of dream matches. You don't get the opportunity to see a Japanese team play a Saudi Arabian team until you get to the final. That's the only downside of it. But it does make sense, because it would be unmanageable, because this continues all the way up until the final itself. So you have knockout round after the group stage, then quarterfinal, semi-finals and final. And you basically have the semi-final against the best other team from your conference. I think this is exactly the same as the MLS, in fact. And then the final is between basically the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference. So most years it is someone, for example, Saudi Arabia or Qatar against someone from Japan or Korea, for example. So the last one was Al Hilal of Saudi Arabia. They are sort of the Real Madrid of this division, of this competition. They won it most times. They lost the last final to Urawa Red Diamonds of Japan, who they have a bit of a rivalry with. They keep on getting them in the final. Sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. And the previous year, Al Hilal won it. The other weird thing that you might assume is that there is a one-off final somewhere in the Asian continent. It's not the case. They did switch to that during COVID, and they had the final last year in Saudi Arabia. 2 years ago in Saudi Arabia. Al Hilal happened to be in it, and they were at home, essentially, because it was in their home stadium. However, normally it's a two-legged playoff, so if, for example, it's the equivalent of, let's say Liverpool against Real Madrid, you play the first tie in Anfield and the second in Madrid. It's a bit weird, but I kind of understand it would be very difficult for fans to, if you're coming from Saudi Arabia to fly to Australia for the final, very few of you would go. So again, it's to do with travel costs, distance, and in some situations, some clubs are more poorly supported than they are in, say, England, Germany, Spain, Italy. So there are fewer fans that would spend their hard-earned cash travelling that sort of distance to a country abroad. We take it for granted in Europe. If the final one year is in, Turkey, it's a 3-hour flight probably to Istanbul. Paris was the year before. You could get the train from most places in Europe, including Britain, and get to Paris in like an hour or two. It's not the case in Asia at all. Even from one side of Australia to the next is something ridiculous, like 3 hours, so by plane. So trying to get, if you're Chinese and you want to be in the final, and if the final's in, I don't know, let's think, Qatar, then it's a good, 5-6 hours to get there by plane. So it's a two-legged final rather than a one-off final, which does dampen it down a little bit. But I totally understand, otherwise it'd probably be an empty stadium somewhere. Okay, the other assumption you might have is that teams can just have, 11 Brazilians on the pitch and it doesn't even matter. This is completely not the case. In fact, this year has seen an increase for the first time. I think previously you were only allowed 4 foreign players. And because of things like the European Union and the Schengen zone in Europe, we don't consider someone from the next door country as foreign in our league as such, but it definitely is in Asia. So in this competition starting soon, I'll go over that as my next point, when it's starting and when it finishes, you're going to be allowed 6 only in your entire team, not just on the pitch at one time. You can have plenty on the bench. No, it's 6 in total registered, one of which has to be another Asian. So for example, if you are in Japan, you can have 5 Brazilians, but you can't have 6. You've got to have 1 Korean, for example, or Chinese, or Australian. So yes, only 6 foreigners, one of which has to be of another Asian country. So technically 5 from Europe and South America or Africa, for example. So that does maintain the sort of, it means that you're not sort of got loads of Argentinians, Brazilians, etc. in your squad, which means that, your youngsters can come through. But maybe on another hand, it has hampered how many foreign players are allowed to come and attract more people to watch the matches because they've got better skills, for example. So that is a sort of, I think that's why they're slowly allowing it to creep up. Some countries have got around this by, such as Qatar, nationalising, China did it as well, nationalising foreigners sooner than they would normally. So, for example, after 2 years of being in the league or 3 years of being in the league, opposed to 5, which is what the normal amount is, they've given them a Qatari passport or a Chinese passport and called them up to the national team, and then that way they're able, these Brazilian-born players are able to both play for the national team, but then also they don't count as a foreigner anymore. So some countries can't do that. I don't think you can ever get a Saudi passport if you're not born in the country. So they can't do it, for example, unless they change the law of their entire country. But yeah, so that's a sort of interesting aside. Okay, the other thing I was going to talk about was Australia. Australia, after years of not having very good continental competition and qualifying for the World Cup, petitioned the Asian Confederation to take them, and they said yes. Overall, I think it improves the AFC. Having Australia, it'll be interesting to see whether New Zealand ever decide to follow them. There is a situation now for the next World Cup onwards that the Oceania Confederation are going to have 1 guaranteed spot at the World Cup. So New Zealand usually at least get to the knockout stage. They won't have to have a knockout stage anymore. They can just beat the people, their local rivals, and then they go straight to the World Cup. So would that discourage them from going to the Asian Confederation? Maybe. The other thing of note is that, similar to Canadian teams in the MLS in the States, there are, there's definitely one Wellington Phoenix team that plays in the Australian A-League. And if they finish top 2 in the Australian League, they're not allowed to play in the Asian League, so they could win the league potentially in Australia but not be allowed to qualify. The next best team in the league would get the qualification spot for the Asian Champions League. I think this either happened or nearly happened a couple of years ago. Yeah, I think it's Wellington Phoenix is the team in the A-League, and they finished high enough to qualify but weren't allowed or nearly did, something like that. And there was a little bit of that wasn't written in as a rule because no other country has a team playing in their league from outside of the Asian Confederation. So it was a bizarre thing that just happened in Australia, and then I think then they changed the rules to state that even if you've got different countries playing in your league, then they don't qualify for the Asian Champions League if they're not an Asian team officially. So yeah, they had to sort of do something quite quickly about that to stop the New Zealanders getting into the Asian Champions League via the A-League in Australia. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was when it starts and when it finishes. This year is going to be the first year that the Asian Champions League starts at the same time as the European Champions League, as in it starts in September, I think it's going to start. Let me just see the dates I've got it in front of me. August. So qualifying 8 to the 22nd of August, and the competition proper starts on the 18th of September. And it will run through until the 18th of May, and this is the first time. And I read an article on it, and one of the major reasons was that they wanted to attract European viewers and South American viewers, because we have this sense that, you know, football starts in August, September and ends in May, and they were missing out because they always started around the March time and ended in October, November. So they would have, you know, the cup final in November, and, you know, it wasn't really that much of an interest to us here in Europe. So I think that they are trying to attract an audience for us. It'll also help them in other ways as well. I think this year really hampered them with the World Cup. Obviously, they had their final something like a week before the countries broke up for the World Cup. So that was a little bit awkward with timing as well. So that's another reason. Because this year, obviously, the World Cup was in winter, but when it's in the summer, it does prove to be a little bit tricky, because that is when leagues are currently in play. So they have to have a break from their league in the middle of the season. So Saudi Arabia have already changed their league season, so now they're starting September and ending in May as well, same as European teams. And yeah, so I think a couple of other nations will swap as well. Not all of them, I think some like Korea and Japan still go from January to December, but it'll remain to be seen whether they will switch soon or if they have, and I just wasn't aware of it already, to make it easier to qualify. Otherwise, something weird is going to happen where you finish as champions in, say, December in Korea, but you're not in the Champions League because last year's champions are in because it starts in September, so you're not champions yet, and then you have to wait till the following year to be in it. Yeah, so that's a bit of a weird. It's out of kilt, so that doesn't quite work. So I think that quite a lot, Saudi Arabia's already changed, for example. Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about was eligibility for, I touched on it earlier on. So they've started to do coefficient rankings a little bit better. So I've just been reading that the top 12 on the east and the top 12 on the western side get qualifications, and they very similar to the way it works in Europe. As you go up, you get more. So the top will get 4, the next couple down will get 3 spots, maybe one of which will be a playoff spot, so 2 in the group stage and 1 in the playoff. That's something they haven't done quite as well for some time, and it was often ranked on criteria of, you know, quality of the stadia, for example, and things like that. So if you do well, for example, one of the Pakhtakor from Uzbekistan got to a semi-final a couple of years ago, and as a result this year they've got 3 slots, I think it is, in the Champions League. So they had 1 slot at the time, or 2 slots maybe. So similar to the way it works and has worked in Europe for some time. Say, for example, Scotland, if you get a Scottish team doing well, then they get 2 guaranteed spots in the Champions League group stage. If they do worse, then sometimes they have to do a playoff, or even the champions have to have a playoff. So yeah, it's becoming more similar in that way, but in the past it wasn't always in that sort of way. Also, I just read, and if you win the Asian Champions League now, or this minor cup, which is for the nations outside of the top 12, so places like, for example, well, Hong Kong are doing quite well at the second. I was going to say Hong Kong, maybe, I'm trying to think of a country, Myanmar maybe, or Syria. So countries that are outside of the top 12, if they win their cup, which is the AFC, I think it's called the AFC Cup, then they automatically qualify for the playoffs the year after, even if their normal association doesn't guarantee it. So yeah, so it's becoming more and more similar to the European Champions League all the time. It hasn't been so, but yeah, it's it's quite a fun sort of competition to watch. I'm on the YouTube channel. I've subscribed to the YouTube channel. You can watch all of the games either in full or the highlights. I recommend watching the last couple of finals if you want to. They're really good matches, really good support. If you watch the last final, which has, like I said, an away game and a home game and away game, Al Hilal and Red Diamonds, then the crowd support, particularly in Japan, but both in Saudi Arabia and Japan, was absolutely fantastic. Very partisan home crowds, obviously, which affects the way that the match works. So yeah, check out the last couple of videos and see for yourself. But this video's gone on way longer than I meant it to do. But yeah, that's this little ramble for today, talking about the Asian Champions League, and I'll do a little preview before the competition starts in the next couple of weeks. Okay, take care everyone. But hope you enjoyed the video anyway. Click like, drop a comment, and I'll see you again really soon. Bye.